Good evening, Eagle's Nest. Welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 17. Today we're going to look at the third escalator that Jesus talks about in his Sermon on the Mount. The first escalator was anger. The second escalator was lust. The third escalator is lying. According to Jesus, the way to get off the escalator of anger is to make reconciliation with others a priority in our lives. According to Jesus, the way to get off the escalator of lust is to do whatever it takes. And with both of these, it may require some help from others. So if you're struggling with either of these, I would encourage you to reach out to a friend, a pastor, or a counselor. Tonight, we want to look at the third escalator, and the third escalator is lying. We all know that one lie leads to another and that no one has to teach our kids to lie. They just kind of figure that out themselves. Why? Because we, from our youth, believe that lying will either protect us, benefit us in some way, or get us off the hook. But in actuality, lying puts us on a downward escalator. So Jesus tells us to get off of it. Let's read Matthew 5:33 and 37 together. Jesus says, "Again you have heard that it was said of those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is God's footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one." Jesus is telling us here that this third escalator has to do with swearing or oaths. Now Jesus begins by telling us again that you have heard that it was said. This refers to something called the Mishnah. These were the sayings of the rabbi, and at this time in history they were not written down. They were communicated orally from one generation, one rabbi to another. Around 200 AD, after Christ, these things were written down, what's called the Mishnah. What the rabbi taught from or talked about was the Mikra, or what was written, and that would be the Bible or the Torah. And so Jesus is saying, you've heard it said. This is the teachings of the rabbi. The teachings of the rabbi were what they taught about what the Bible or the Old Testament said. Jesus is telling us here that what the rabbi taught about the fourth commandment, which is found in the Ten Commandments, is a little bit off. The fourth commandment, as we'll see, is in Exodus chapter 20, and it refers to swearing or speaking in the name of God. Now you may have noticed already that the first two escalators that we've dealt with both deal with one of the Ten Commandments written in Exodus chapter 20. Jesus ties the escalator of anger to the sixth commandment, which is do not murder. So he connects those two. Jesus connects the escalator of lust to the seventh commandment, which says do not commit adultery. Now he's dealing with the fourth commandment found in Exodus 20 verse 7, which says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Most of us have been taught or have heard that this is talking about not cussing. And certainly it can be applied to cussing. For instance, the Jews took this commandment so seriously that they wouldn't even say the name of God, Yahweh, in fear of violating this command. They substituted the word Adonai, which means Lord, for Yahweh whenever they would read the Bible. But this commandment is primarily addressing keeping the vows that they would make in God's name. Like when you're in court and you place your hand on the Bible and they ask you, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? And then you say, I do. That's taking an oath, or that's swearing in the name of God. This commandment is primarily focused on when you do that, make sure you tell the truth. Or when you swear an oath that you're going to do something, make sure that you fulfill it. But years later, the rabbi came along and began to teach the people about what this text said, or what they meant, what they thought it meant, or what they thought it said, or what they thought how you should apply it. They said, yes, you should keep your vows and do what you promise. However, the rabbi were lawyers, and like lawyers, they began to create loopholes to get around this commandment. And they began to teach things like if a person took an oath in God's name, it was considered binding. In other words, you had to do what you said. You had to keep your word and you had to tell the truth. So if you swore in the Bible like you do in court and you gave your oath and you swore that you would tell the truth and nothing but the truth, the whole truth, so help you God, you had to do what you said. You had to tell the truth. But if people swore by something else, like heaven or earth or one's head or by one's truck or by one's house, you didn't have to keep your oath. You could basically fib, or you could basically not do what you said you would do. Now in truth, this would be a lie. We talk about white lies, but this goes even further than a white lie. This is basically saying you can swear, but if you don't swear in the name of God, you don't have to have any intention of fulfilling that command. Well, you could see where this could go. And so what they were really doing was creating a loophole where people could get around this fourth commandment and not fulfill it. And by doing so, they were teaching people how to do the least according to this commandment, the minimum, which would even lead to disobeying what this commandment actually taught. We need to remember that the context of these 5 escalators, and this escalator particularly, is Jesus contrasting the righteousness of the rabbi and Pharisees of his day with the righteousness of the kingdom of heaven in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. In these verses, Jesus is talking about how he interprets, explains, and applies the Bible. And simply put, the kingdom of heaven, which he is preaching, is what Jesus is talking about here. In the kingdom of heaven, he says in Matthew 5:20 that unless our righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, we will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, by the kingdom of heaven, he's talking about God's power, God's presence, and God's purpose. And in order for us to do God's will, which would be his purpose, we need to receive God's power and experience his presence. In God's kingdom, his people don't do the minimum, they do the maximum. In God's kingdom, people don't look for ways to get around doing God's commandments. They look for ways to completely fulfill them. Jesus is telling us here that the way to get off of this escalator is to become a person of our word. Become so honest that when you give your word, you don't need an oath for people to believe you. Do you remember when you were a kid, you would tell somebody an outlandish story and you wanted them to believe it so much that you would say something like, "Cross my heart and hope to die, stick a needle in my eye"? We said this to get the people we were talking to believe us. Jesus is saying, if your way of life is to tell the truth, you won't need to take an oath, for people will believe you. When you become a person of your word becomes your bond. You know, today, when you buy a car or a house, you have to sign 100 pieces of paper in a contract. Why? Because we become a nation that has learned to look for loopholes. We look for ways of getting out of what we promised. Jesus says, get off this escalator. Become a person of your word. Don't follow the teachings that you've been given by tradition of your rabbi in how to get around this commandment. Instead, learn to do what you say you're going to do. Tell the truth. Become a person of your word. Anything else, he says, is of the evil one, or it leads to evil. Or in other words, you're going to end up sticking a needle in your eye. Become a person of truth. Next week, we'll look at the 4th escalator, vengeance. You don't want to miss this one. Good night.